Why hello there, my favourite nerds in all the world, and welcome back. This week, as promised, we're delving into the technology of the gas lamp era, so the 19th century. We're going to do it particularly in England, and we're going to look at how this technology affects the setting of your story. Let's get on with it, shall we? When discussing the technological backdrop of the Gaslamp Fantasy setting, it would be an oversight to not start with the titular technology, the gas lamps. Before electricity became sufficiently widespread and economical to allow for general public use, gas was the most prevalent method of outdoor and indoor lighting in cities and suburbs. The most common fuels were wood gas, coal gas, and even occasionally water gas. The first use of gas to make light was in the 1720s, but it took a little bit of time until the actual gas lamps were made, which was in the 1790s, and then they didn't even become widespread until the 1820s. As for the end of the gas lamp era, well, that would be the 1880s, when voltage lighting began to replace gas lamps. But, you know, we're pretty slow to adopt technology, so a rough guideline of the 1800s to the 1900s works pretty well to define the gas lamp era. And why is any of this important for your setting? Because already it gives you a pretty iconic imagery to evoke in your reader's imagination. That of the gas lamps. You can wax lyrically for a line or two about them, and your reader's going to get a good sense quite early on about where the story is set. You can even have a lamplighter going about their business, as happened in the early days, but later designs were self-igniting. Was the gas lamp the only source of nightlight available to the people of the era? No, they had easy access to candles, oil lamps, and wood fires, so don't feel like every light source in your story has to be gas lit. In fact, use of these other light sources might be a nice way to distinguish between the more well-off parts of your society and those that are less well-off, since not everyone can afford the same means of lighting. Now, I could spend a whole video on the gas lamp alone, but onwards we go. From gas lamps to another big technological advancement that was dependent on gas, and that's the automobile, which started being commercially produced in the late 1880s, so towards the very end of the gas lamp era, which makes it a great tool in your setting if you really want to ground your readers in the story being set in the tail end of the 19th century. And this part of gas lamp era England really was a time of rapid technological change. Showing how far these new technologies have already spread through a society is a great way of demonstrating that. You can show cars going from being rare to increasingly common, and electric lamps replacing gas lamps. If you're not a car fan, however, and you want to base your story prior to their arrival, then you're going to have to start thinking about more typical modes of transport. For the most part, we're talking about people walking on foot in the 1800s, but for those who could afford it, you could pay for a stagecoach or a hackney coach. Or even if you were particularly well off, you could have your own horses stabled, thus allowing you to ride in style in your own coach. In the 1820s came the omnibus, which could carry between 12 and 15 passengers. From the 1830s onwards, railways were the name of the game for commuters, and the underground came about in the 1860s, along with trams in the 1870s. Lest, of course, we forget the arrival of the bicycle in the 1880s. Before that, then you've got your good old-fashioned penny farthing that we would expect to see teetering dangerously around. Moving on to other technological advances of the 19th century. There are a lot, so we're going to have to move quickly to keep up. Well, there was the widespread adoption of the telegraph in the 1850s, the telephone from the 1870s onwards, and you can start thinking of synonyms for the click-clacking of typewriters, the use of which became also widespread in the 1870s. We have photographs in the 1840s and early cinema in the 1890s. Depending on what part of the 19th century you're setting your story in, you can already start to see the huge impact this could have on your story. Time now for the medical status quo of the era. First off, forget about blood transfusions. These weren't routine until the 1900s. And if your story was set before the 1840s, forget about anaesthetic. There are some rare accounts of people using sponges soaked with opium and mandragora as far back as the 1200s, but it wasn't until nitrous oxide really started being used in the 1840s that people got any sort of reprieve during surgery. And prior to the 1860s, there was no recognition that surgeries should take place in clean environments, so expect about half of your operations to result in infections. X-rays and cholera vaccines didn't come through until the very end of the 19th centuries, but there was a vaccine for smallpox during the 1800s. So what does all of this mean for the death stats in your story? Well, the average life expectancy you'll be aiming for varies depending on where the character is living and working. Labourers in Manchester at the time had an average life expectancy of 17. Yeah, you heard me right. 17. We have advances in public health measures to thank for a lot of the improvements since then. One particularly important one that happened in the late 1840s was a Public Health Act passed after a particularly bad cholera epidemic. Refuse started being collected, sewers were created, and clean water supplies were created. This really is a key one for your story. If you're setting your story before the 1840s, then you'll get a real sense of the smells and the visuals that you'll be able to describe to your readers. So, tech is important. Tech is what enabled the Public Health Act of the 1840s to come about. And understanding the tech of the era allows you to set your story not only in a time window that works for your plot, but also one that has the internal consistency to help readers continue to be absorbed in the story and not get jarred by it. I don't know about you, but many of the books and shows I've read over the years based in this era haven't seemed anywhere near so technically advanced as a lot of the technology I've just gone through. This is a fallacy of fiction, one that can make the inclusion of these technologies seem almost counterintuitive to an author. But just because previous authors haven't included those technologies in their stories, it doesn't mean that you can't as well. In fact, doing the opposite is a great way to give your story a different feel to it. The only point to note is that you might get a little backlash from readers who aren't used to reading stories that more accurately reflect the technology of the era. But I'm a firm believer in not dumbing something down just to pander. If nobody breaks the mold, then we're all doomed to make the same mistakes over and again. Hey guys, just jumping in here a moment because I was finishing up with the editing of the video and I realised there was a point I missed entirely that I should have made very clear, especially since it's important to fantasy writers, where it's entirely your choice which technologies and scientific advancements you choose to incorporate into your story. And the point is that you shouldn't feel constrained by everything I've gone through here, or feel like you have to incorporate all of the relevant technology for your chosen era. Secondary worlds are secondary. They're made up. They allow you to ask questions of what life might have been like if this technology had never been invented, or if that discovery had never been made, or even if this other discovery was made in a time before it was actually made. You have the freedom to do whatever you want. All that comes from having a better understanding of how things were is that you can better understand the knock-on implications of what you change. But more on that in a future video. First of all, we just need to understand the rules before we can break them. But enough technological, theological preaching. What else does the presence of these technologies mean for your story, besides the layering of descriptions? The obvious impact of when you pick during this era will be the speed people can travel long distances, and their ability to communicate quickly with people who are a long way away. The faster people can travel between locations, the faster goods can be transported between those locations, the faster ideas spread, fashion and news. Expect elements of other cultures around the world for that time period to start showing up in a setting too. Showing their arrival can be a great way of demonstrating the interconnectedness of the world. Well, that's it, my nerds. I hope this has helped. Get putting your requests in the chat for which era I should cover next. Let's explore somewhere a little further afield than jolly old England, shall we? Bye, my nerds.